Amazing. Thanks, Gareth. Okay, so normally we run the session for about 30 minutes of delivery. We allow enough time at the end for some question and answer. That's pretty flexible. So if there's a lot of really good delivery and content, then we can allow that to run on. Or if there's a lot of questions coming through on the chat, then we'll try and manage that accordingly. Okay, so over to you, Richard. I'll allow you to share your screen so that you can start the presentation.
I think I already am sharing.
Hold on, let me stop sharing. There we go. So if you'd like to tap the share button on. Are you able to locate that? Perfect.
Is that showing? I can't see if it's showing at your end, but
I can see a screen, the title slide that says specification writing.
Great.
Thank you.
Hi everybody. Thanks to CIAT for giving us the opportunity to talk to you today. So yes, we are going to just give an introduction effectively on specification writing, the importance of specification writing, and some best practice do's and don'ts. So I thought it would be useful for us to share this with you in a very high level format. Oops. So just an introduction to Spec Studio. We're an independent consultancy. So we were formed in 2021. Personally, I've been in the specification industry for over 25 years. In the late 90s with Schumann Smith and Davis Langdon Schumann Smith. And so there's been a lot of change throughout that period, but ultimately a lot of the principles still remain. So Spec Studio, as I say, is independent. We work with lots of different clients, all different sectors, different markets, but we certainly have a lot of experience. So we thought it would be useful to try and share that. We're very keen on sharing the knowledge out into industry because it's a bit of a sort of a dying art really in terms of how to prepare a good detailed specification. So hence why we're here today. These are the types, some of the clients that we work with, big names, little names, international practices, even down to, you know, small 1 or 2 man band practices. So we cover all shapes and sizes. So we're not just, you know, covering the sort of top 5% of the work. We're down to doing, you know, domestic scale too. Like I say, lots of different sectors, sports, commercial, residential, all sorts, even including you know, large opera houses in the Middle East. So this, you know, the scale and breadth of our experience is pretty broad. So specification consultancy. A lot of practices over the years have had in-house spec writers, and it's usually a very experienced person who ends up working on most of the projects. It's, again, these people are few and far between, and it's a very skilled profession. But it's very difficult to retain those people. It's also difficult to gain knowledge of wider projects experience. And this was really where specification consulting came from. in the late 90s with Foster and Partners, whereby the need to prepare different types of specifications to suit procurement came into play. The design and build really came to the fore, and performance specs in those days were really they just weren't really available. So that's really where it became, a starting point. We were preparing bespoke, detailed specs that reflected the design intent, and it's not just about writing what products were required, it's actually conveying to the contractor what he needs to do. And hence the specification consultant profession in the UK has sort of flourished now to the extent that it is actually a bona fide profession, and it's actually contained within the plan of work. In America, it's actually a recognized profession with qualification. It isn't here at the moment. That is something that we are looking at because we do think that it's important for architects and technicians to have this as a skill set. So it is something that we're looking at. Now, this might seem a bit of an obvious one, really, in terms of what is a specification. Yes, it's a written document, but it's more really about what it can do for you. It basically covers items that are not on the drawings or in schedules. Even today, with everything being digital, it remains a fundamental contractual document that sits alongside the drawings and the digital model. It deals, with lots of different items, but ultimately it's there to provide support for your design. This is also now becoming important in terms of BSA and golden thread. So the sort of continuity of information from the early stages of design, taking right the way through the process, in a written and traceable form. This isn't something that over the years has been a requirement, but as you probably all know, if you get into a stage where you've got a potential claim, it's the specification that really will get you out of trouble. So not to kind of over dramatize that, but it is certainly used and has been cited in quite a few court cases that we're aware of. And so the need for having concise and detailed specifications that actually define what the contractor and specialist subcontractors should be doing comes to the fore. It's not the most glamorous end of the design process. I think we all understand that, and probably most of these points here would be quite familiar with a lot of you. It's kind of hence why we're here, but really, in terms of sort of principles, these are all the things that really should never be done. It's quite surprising, really, that specifications are actually given such a low priority in the design process. There's a lot of emphasis given to the drawn set of information and the visual side of things, when the contractual element of it is contained within the spec, and that is really the important side of it. So it should be started early. It shouldn't be copy and pasted from the previous. It needs to be project specific and very clear and concise. So in terms of base principles, the first thing we always say is, have you got your design responsibility buttoned down? even the language that we use for this now has been adopted by the RIBA in terms of prescriptive and descriptive information. These are extracts from the plan of work. But in the old days, these were sort of specialist terms that weren't really necessarily widely known. But having a clear and concise design responsibility matrix, both in terms of your appointments and right the way through when the contractor comes on board, absolutely vital to set out who's doing what and when. And it doesn't have to be in this format, but ultimately it is a key document. So in terms of principles, that's the first thing that we would advise every practice to adopt. Ultimately, the way that we view it is there's two forms of specification. There is one which is ultimately prescriptive, whereby the designer takes design responsibility for uh, the element. It might be that you fully name a product, but it might be a materials and workmanship as well. But ultimately, it would be something that the designer would be taking on board, whether that's the architect, landscape designer, technicians, whoever. The other being descriptive, which is a performance with the visual intent of the design drawings associated with it. In the old days, we used to have clause 42, which was a non-visual item, but ultimately it's still descriptive. It's still a CDP item. There's lots of different variations that people come up with, like prescriptive plus or descriptive plus. But when you distill it down, there's two main routes. And there are subtleties associated with all of those variants, but ultimately think about it in that way. And it makes life a lot easier to think about it like that. But for descriptive items, one of the key things is whether or not you're going to be giving indicative manufacturers. You don't have to. You might just be describing the visual intent, but be careful that it is something that the market will accommodate as contractor design, i.e., that you will be able to get a specialist subcontractor to undertake the detailed design and underwrite it with his own PI insurance. Because if you can't, then there's not much point in trying to go down that route. Second key thing is that the specs should reflect the procurement route and the form of contract. Here in the UK, the majority of projects fall into these four categories. Four types of procurement. Traditional, obviously, where you're working right the way through as a designer. Design and build is and has been the most popular for major projects over the last 20 years. However, increasingly, we're now seeing more MC and CM type contracts where clients are wanting to have more of an influence over the actual procurement and less of it associated with a contractor, or that the contractors don't want to take on the risk. But the way that the specification is written needs to be related to how it's going to be procured. And each of those come with their own quirks. I mean, both MC and CM are usually done in packages, whether it's works packages or trade packages. The terminology for the various parties that are associated with those procurement routes need to be embodied into the spec. So, if it's design and build, it would be the employer or the employer's agent written to the contractor. If it was management contracting, it might be the management contractor to the works contractor, things like that. next big thing really, and everybody will be aware of this, is the Building Safety Act. And this is having a huge impact on the industry. It's still being flushed through, and everybody's trying to find their way through it. But for ourselves, in terms of how it affects specifications, we have introduced in our own baseline documents specific clauses relating to BSA and then also for high risk buildings. So we put these into our architectural prelims so that we're making sure that the contractor is aware in terms of how it impacts the specification, what we're asking him to do, and reminding him these are the things he needs to do, particularly around change control, substitution, that type of thing, needs to be set out clearly. So there's no ambiguity, there's no grey areas. In terms of how it's impacting on the industry, you'll probably be aware of lots of discussions about whether the design has to be fully designed in advance of Gateway 2. We're still getting mixed signals on that. It's not there's no clear pro forma as far as we can tell. We're getting quite a few sort of anecdotal sets of information, but there isn't still really clarity around it. It's affecting the duration of projects. There needs to be clear methodology around change control, whether or not that will affect how contractors deal with things later on. Again, still not really clear. But ultimately, in terms of spec, there needs to be the golden thread running through it in terms of demonstrating the compliance. And that means updating specification or being able to trace the authorship right the way through and at the various different stages and who is taking the ownership for those decisions. And that comes through in terms of digital model, outputs from digital model, etc., etc. But ultimately, from a specification perspective, there needs to be able to way to track the changes. Again, there's no pro forma for that. We're seeing in terms of programs, people are now incorporating specific durations into these for Gateway 2. Whether or not they are realistic is a different matter given the backlog. But it's just an example, really, that this is having a big impact on design teams right the way throughout Gateway 2 and also coming up to Gateway 3 now. So I'm just going to hand over to Brian just to run through the main types of specification formats that really you'll probably see.
So generally, witin the UK, we have our cores, which is our common arrangement of work sections, and Uniclass, which has come in to kind of hit the BIM requirements. Generally, be more agnostic across these systems. We also have our outlining specifications which can be used at an earlier point, and we have also developed an in-house small works specification as well to help with smaller residential style schemes. We'll go through that in a minute. And we have the CSI master format, which is kind of used internationally across the Middle East and other areas which we use. So you can see that it's kind of like a breakdown of the different formats. Sorry, I can just see a bit percent. It's difficult to hear.
Yeah, it's a bit crackly, Brian.
Sorry. So there's obviously a breakdown.
Yeah. Sorry, Brian, can I just come in there? To me, I was just wondering if it was a distorted microphone to anyone else, and it might be that we continue as we are, but that potentially you might have another microphone or.
Is that any better?
Mate, that is so much better. Let's continue like that. Thank you so much. Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No worries. No worries.
So yeah, so what we've got here is our kind of the breakdown of the different formats between. So as you can see there, you've got your standard course system, which breaks it down into like your H11s, your F10s. You've got your uni-class system, which is kind of can be system-based and product-based between the SS and PRs. And then we have our CSI master format, which is broken down into like 6 code areas. A little bit similar. It's a bit of a kind of a hybrid, that one more between uni-class and cores. Do you want to go to the next one? So yeah, we've got our cores here published in 1987 and linked to SMM7. It's still probably our most popular one that we use in the UK still, and caters for the majority of clients where BIM isn't required. I mean, what I think can be a misconception is that when you look at the BIM documents like EIRs and BEPS, you don't have to specifically use unit class specification formats. That is just kind of coding of the information within there. And you can still use your course system because that's hitting the more the level of information needs, which we've kind of been looking at around how we can do all this between it. So Uniclass is being developed by MBS, and it has kind of evolved into this system where people believe that they have to use this to hit the ISO 19650 requirements, but kind of the feedback we've had from clients is generally that they're using it where they have to use it. They would prefer to use cores where possible. It is a lot more prescriptive in the information that you have to produce, and having done a number of them, it can be a lot more kind of time consuming to produce that information between it. And yeah, there's just a lot more workmanship and execution that's kind of tagged on as you're having to try and do that even in descriptive areas as well. So generally the advice that I always give when we have these is check your BEP, check your EIRs, OIRs and AIRs and PIRs to see what they're actually requesting, because they might just be requesting for Uniclass to be applied to the objects, which can be done via another add-in. Excellent. Yeah, generally, it's just the information container within the project where they are just asking for Uniclass code to be applied to a door. That doesn't have to be per se through a spec. That can be done through an add-in on whichever kind of software you're using. And it's just so when it goes into a BIM model at the end, the Excel sheet, that can kind of filter through whichever PR they need, or whichever product they need, or whichever system they need. So CSI master format is, I've been quite fortunate to work on some of the projects in the Middle East, and it just uses 6-digit classification between. It's very similar to how cores is set up, so kind of like your F10 for your gypsum partitions. It's just basically 6 digits kind of to do it that way as a gypsum board partition. And generally in the Middle East, where I've done work on this, is kind of where they prefer this to be used over any other one. So it's, yeah, very similar, just slightly different. So what we do is we have kind of like our outline spec document, which we do like in a Google Sheet scenario, where we pick up workmanship clauses and other parts in it, where you're kind of not needing a full spec and picking up the description of the items within there. Sometimes people do ask for a spec to be provided through whichever software platform we use. And generally it's kind of just an A3 document at the end of this, where it is picking up all the material, product, system performances. So it is going into that kind of next stage, it's picking up all design intent and the quality of what you're willing to kind of imply through the drawings and through the specifications and schedules. And this is something that we've developed in-house. So this is kind of our small works section specification. And what we've done is we've kind of realized that on some projects, people aren't going to want a full kind of MBS or kind of platform specification that we use for kind of one-off houses or extensions kind of that way. So we've actually looked at developing something which is more of like a lighter version of the spec, where we're kind of picking out the quality of the work and the materials with technical notes provided on drawings as well. We don't really put submittals or performance clauses in there because we try to keep it as kind of open as possible within there, and there is limited testing within that, but it's kind of catering to that smaller area where you're not having to kind of pay for a large subscription outcome on a software. It is giving that opportunity to have a lighter version spec to complement your drawings. I'll hand you back to Richard.
To me. So yeah. So I'm going to talk about some best practice, and this first slide is just really about the basics, and then I'll go into a lot more detail. As I've talked about earlier, the importance of starting off on the right foot, understanding where you're coming from. So making sure that you know what procurement on requirements are, if you've got a BEP, that those things need to be taken on board. Understand your scope. Sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised the amount of conversations we get involved with where there's a lot of grey areas between disciplines as to who is taking responsibility for what. And then there's the design responsibility associated with those items. A lot of large practices also have in-house working groups, whether it's about sustainability, whether it's about fire, whether it's about lessons that you've learned on your different types of projects, or what your insurers are saying to you in terms of what they want you to specify or not. That needs to be taken into account and made sure that your staff are aware of. Obvious things like starting off with a current specification base, whether or not that is your own in-house, whether it's using a proprietary software like MBS or master format or any of the other types of ones that are on the market. Do that as obviously make sure that you've got that as your starting point. The last point really there is to make sure that architects and designers seem to be inherently helpful people, and it's to make sure that you don't overstep the mark, and where you are being asked to make changes, that you properly consider them, because ultimately it will be your responsibility. And there have been a few cases on this recently. I'm not going to go into detail, but if you're being told to make a change and you've got like 24 hours to do that, I wouldn't advise you do that. I would recommend that you push back and state that you need your defined period to review information for alternatives before you take on board any change to your original design. So these are key basics. Then in terms of more sort of detail, I put together here a list, a sort of a checklist really. And obviously this will be recorded, so it's circulated, but again, a lot of these seem pretty obvious, but the amount of times that we see this is quite common. So make sure you understand the procurement, is it a packaged set of information that's required? Are you making sure that the spec is appropriate to the design stage, whether it's outline, tender, two-stage tender, novated stage? All of these things would have an impact in terms of the content of the spec. Your scope, again, make sure you're clear about that. Make sure that you've got a proper DRM in place that defines which elements are CDP and which elements are not. And where you have got CDP, then in the spec, make sure that you put proper levels of control around your submittals. What if it's a pure performance, you're going to be asking for the contractor to come back with a solution. And the only way that you're going to be able to control that is by setting out clearly what you want to receive back. And that can be samples, mock-ups, prototypes, benchmarks on site, all these things, which again seem really obvious, but need to be properly defined. Sustainability targets are increasingly important now, and we're doing a lot more retrofit and refurb. So this is much more prevalent. So again, the design decisions about materials need to be taken early, make sure that those thoughts have been conveyed and the decisions that have been made actually go into the spec. Clear, concise, coordinated, consistent is a classic. Everybody says that's what it needs to be, but it doesn't really happen in practice. That's because it takes time to do these things properly, and they need to be checked. And if it's being done last minute, often that doesn't happen. Some things are better conveyed not in the spec. So I don't know, ironmongery schedules, door schedules, things like this. It's much better and much more concise to have these as referenced out documents. But where you do reference them out, you need to make sure that you're referencing them out properly so that it's actually consistent and that you're not opening yourself up to a potential claim. Same with any cross-referencing between sections or cross-referencing to other discipline specifications, structural engineer, MEP, fire, etc. Make sure that that is consistently referenced. And then tagging your drawings, making sure that the link between the spec and the drawn information, whether it's a model or 2D, is correct. There's lots of different ways that you can tag or link your drawings, but ultimately, whatever system you use, it needs to be consistent. If it's a CDP item, the level of information on the design drawings should reflect that it is a CDP item. If you put too much information on the drawing, you might be restricting the contractor in terms of what he can come back with, in terms of his supply chain. So think about that. Sometimes you have to work it out and then strip it back, but it's important not to litter the drawings with BSs and products and too much information that could then conflict with what you've put in the specification. Then we've got a few sort of classic do's and don'ts, really. We don't use the term approved, we use the term accepted, because we don't think that the architects or the architectural technicians or designers should be actually approving something. What they need to get to a stage is where they're accepting something. Monolithic toughened glass, this is around nickel sulfide inclusions. It's a long-standing issue. So we would use the term safety glass instead of using monolithic. EPDMs, this is a recent thing. They're obviously combustible. So there's some new terminology coming out around that. Interface sealing membranes. So again, these are the common issues that we face, that we see all the time. in terms of best practice for specs, things that just don't get done. So make sure that all of these things do get picked up, and then you will have a decent set of information. This is effectively the kind of reverse of what I've just gone through. But some of the classics there, we see things like manufacturer specs are just dumped in. We just get something that's completely inconsistent with the rest of the document. That's just kind of been shoveled in at the last moment, and it doesn't align with any of the terminology or anything that is, you're trying to achieve with a proper set of information. And I know it's tempting to do that, but it's not going to help you. It's a quick fix to something, but it's not how to do things properly. So yeah, there's quite a few things there. Please make sure that you try and cover all these off. And then when you get to a stage where you've actually produced the document, then you've got to make sure that it's published properly, and build in time associated for that, because with the days now, things are being published up onto various different platforms. It takes time to do all this document control and management. So it's you don't want to get caught out doing that at the last minute. I'm going to hand over to Brian here to talk about tagging.
Yeah, so basically what we've developed is we have kind of out of our Google Sheet, we have our set of codes, titles, and what we've done is we've actually linked the information specifically through Revit at the moment, but we're looking at developing it for other systems such as ArchiCAD, where the information in our ADS is transcribed onto the drawing. So if you have a door, for example, like an external 0-101 external metal door, you can tag that via the keynote tagging parameter. So basically, we're kind of taking the information from one part and placing it into the actual model, and then it's you've got the conduit, which is the ADS between the specs and the Revit model. It's a much better way of doing it than manually typing out text. Then if that door ever changes or a wall ever changes, and it extrapolates it across the model. So we have our ADS obviously on what we would have in a Google Drive of our clients, and they can pull this information off as well. So that's kind of that part. If you want to just jump to the next slide, and then this is kind of how you see we advise people to tag these areas, because if you've got the kind of the CLG 806, for example, suspended feature lattice ceiling, they can then look at the ADS, which is published as well with the spec in one document, and then the contractor is forced to look at the drawing, look at the ADS, and look at the spec. So all your information is within there. If there's any kind of framing out required, or if it's get all the fixings and screws and everything, it's all within there. So they are reading the information side by side. I've been a technician for a long time, and I've done the same, where I've put a lot of information on drawings, but kind of through feedback with our client base, that a lot of clients have taken on this way of doing this, so they are pushing the specs and the drawings to align more. And this one is kind of a drawing where it's just demonstrating how you can tag in the Uniclass environment with using the SS codes and the PR code to pick up the individual items. Again, we're not wanting to kind of pick up a wall tie, for example, or product reference or anything like that. You kind of are saying, this is the PR code for the wall tie. Go look in the specification to find this information. You generally want to avoid as much kind of British standards, as Richard said before, and other kind of manufacturers' names within a drawing, because that's the whole point of the spec. That information is then locked in there. It tidies up the drawings and makes it easy for people to read.
back to you.
Just in terms of where things are going, as with all these things, there's always change, and there's always different types of specification software platforms being promoted. And we're not here to talk about any of those. But I think in the future there is going to become the dependence upon these platforms is more and more prevalent, which means that it kind of takes you down a certain route. We're, as I said, we're agnostic in terms of the software system, so we'll work on all of them. But really, I think in the future, AI will become more prevalent about how these pieces of software link together and linking back to the model. And it's certainly something that we are investigating ourselves. There seems to be quite a pace of change, and I think that it's going to be difficult to keep pace with that if you're not doing it day in, day out, because the functionality of these things are ever increasing, and so it's becoming quite a complicated thing to do in terms of actually preparing specifications these days. Building Safety Act, I think it'll all become the norm, and we will all get our heads around how the information needs to be presented. But then there will need to be this continuity of spec at the various different design and construction stages to enable the actual proper golden thread to occur. There's a bit of a sort of a strange scenario at the moment where that people think, oh, we put everything in the model, but then the contractor puts together an alternative. That doesn't always get put back into the model unless you've got proper information management as part of your scope. So that is something that's going to become more day to day. We're already incorporating sustainability, carbon into specs. Lots more retrofit, lots more refurbishment is going to be undertaken, and those types of specifications have their own quirks, and there's a lot of detail associated with how to refurbish things. So that again is a different skill set and a knowledge base for people to take on board. I think also we are experiencing that a lot of the manufacturers actually do want to collaborate a lot more now. They don't just want to necessarily sell their products as such. So they're wanting to engage with the proprietary software providers, and in terms of giving a good set of consistent information, there are also other industry collaborators, people like Materials 250, who have open APIs, so they're happy to link with various different providers, and it's a great source of information to be able to compare very quickly in product information. And things like also very important really is the actual awareness of how to put specs together, and this is what we're talking about here. But there are also lots of industry groups like the Architectural Technology Leadership Group that we're involved with too. We also are part of education in terms of promoting specifications at the London School of Architecture. Things like this are important to try and spread the word, because otherwise it's very insular, and like I say, it is quite a complicated little industry. But we're here to help and try and spread that knowledge as best we can. And I think that's it. So if anyone's got questions.
Richard,
feel free
first,
to ask.
Richard and Brian, firstly, thank you so much for such an insightful presentation. I can see there are a few questions that are starting to come in. So I'm going to just start at the top, work my way down. I can see that we're also at 13:48, so we'll see what time we have questions for. There was an initial question early on from Denson that has been answered by Gareth on our CIAT Wessex account. So we don't ask our presenters to share their slides. What we do ask is whether they're happy for us to share the presentation on YouTube, and you'll find those presentations for all our CPDs on our CIAT Wessex account on YouTube. So a question from Michael McBride. Michael, what spec writing software is available in the UK and Ireland for small practices?
Well, if it's a proprietary system, there's obviously MBS. That's the main sort of market leader, I guess. If you want to go and buy a proprietary sort of base, they have various different levels. They have a small works, or that is for, you know, as it sort of includes in the title, for smaller scale projects, or they have full-blown chorus for major projects. That is, in terms of proprietary, that's the main one. Like I say, I'm not here to sell ourselves, but we do offer that as well. But that's, yeah, I don't really want to sort of do that here.
No problem. Thank you. So the next question was from Neil Sivens, asking two questions. So the first one is, drawing tagging was in your presentation, but can you offer any other advice on how to make sure specification and drawings are all looked at as one, to avoid the all too often discussion that drawings take precedent over specification or vice versa?
It's interesting because contractually, the specification, in terms of hierarchy, is legally more important. In terms of tagging, yeah, I mean, there's various different ways that people have adopted it over the years, and you know, it doesn't really matter what codes you use, provided it's consistent and you've actually aligned it with the spec. Keynoting seems to be the most popular route, you know, and that's basically just producing a series of codes with a description, and then that gets put into a TXT file, and with Revit that can be uploaded. And I know with Vectorworks there's a slightly different process to it, but again, it's the consistency is the thing that should be stressed, really.
Wonderful, thank you. I trust that answers your question, Neil. And your other question, Neil, was anything we need to be specifically aware of with regards to the Procurement Act 2023?
That's
assuming that's in relation to specifications.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a big topic in itself. That's a separate seminar. I think not really. There's the principles that we've talked about run right the way through that. We're going to be publishing a little sort of paper on that. So I would say watch this space.
Thank you. Okay, so we are coming up to 2 o'clock. We have 8 minutes left. I can see that there's one question that's come in, one last question that we can ask, and that is from Tim. From experience, building control do not wish to refer to a separate specification and therefore want the detail on the drawings. Have you found building control accepting of the specification approach?
I think it depends on the scale of the project. If it is a domestic scale, Yeah, I can understand that building control have said that in the past, because it's easier for them to review. But on a a major project, that's not domestic scale, it would be industry norm for there to be a specification document that's prepared. I mean, even at the smaller scales, like Brian was saying earlier, a small works type spec, even if it's a static document that lists out, key quality requirements, shouldn't be dissuaded by building control, because it's only going to enhance the final product and ensure clarity.
Oh, well, wonderful. Thank you. And that was a great question there, that last question from Tim. And thank you, Richard, for taking the time to answer those. So I'm going to now share a calendar of our CPD and 43 events. And thank you for coming. Thank you to everybody who's joined us today. So far this year, we've had our Building High-Performing Resilient Proactive Teams. That was in January. That was last month. And again, once again, thank you so much to Richard and Brian for coming in today from Spec Studio and delivering that presentation. We know that these presentations always take time to put together and to kind of dot the I's and cross the T's before you actually arrive on the day. So thank you very much for all of the input and for coming in and delivering that. Next up, so the next three in March, on March the 12th, we have MyTech Metal Web Joists coming in and discussing the Future Home Standard. We also have a presentation from Hassan Ahmed and Nasser Ishfaq on the fire and life safety in buildings. And then on the 16th of April, we have CIAT's very own Dan Rossiter from the BSI coming in and discussing technical drawing standards. So that pretty much brings us to conclude today's CPD. Once again, thanks to everyone for coming in, and hope to see you in our next CPD, which you'll find on Eventbrite.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thanks, guys. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Cheerio. Cheers. Bye.